Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. In session 3, we said that verse 3, that he leads us in paths of righteousness for the sake of his name, was like the gravitational pull of the 23rd Psalm. It holds it all together and it brings it into its right order. And we see here now, moving from that gravitational center through suffering and comfort and presence in our suffering, in our dark day of the soul, he turns our eyes back up to ultimate reality, and that ultimate reality being his reign and rule over our lives, but not as a distant king, but as a shepherd that has set a feast before us. For the last 12 years, every New Year's Eve, my closest friends gather in my house starting about 2 in the afternoon, and they bring the best food that we can afford and the best drink that we can afford, and we spend from about 2 in the afternoon till about 2, maybe 3 in the morning just feasting. We cook together and we eat until we can't eat anymore. And when David here puts into this passage, he prepares a table before me. He's making a reference to feasting, and not just any kind of feasting, but the kind of feasting that the Jews would do in this period of time, which would oftentimes last days on end and would be filled with kind of the choicest meats and drinks and the best of whatever they could gather. And so David is lifting our eyes back up to the grandeur of God, like he did in verse 3, like he's trying to remind us in verse 4. And now in verse 5, he's talking about God yet again being an initiating God, moving towards us as we've come out of the valley of the shadow of death, not with a loaf of bread to steady us on our journey, but with a feast. And he's prepared that feast not in private. See, it's a key thing for you to get. And again, this is all rooted in verse 3. This is all rooted in session 3, that he is not embarrassed that you are his. Despite your struggles, despite your difficulties, despite whatever happened in the dark night of the soul, God is not throwing a party for you tucked away in some far off place where nobody knows that he treasures you, he loves you, he delights in you. The text says he's preparing that feast in front of your enemies, that your enemies are aware of God's pleasure over you, his love for you, his gladness over you. In fact, he wants to make sure, in fact, he puts an exclamation point on this idea by the next phrase in the passage, where he anoints you with oil. And so in this period of time, men and women who were in mourning, coming out of the valley of the shadow of death, would have sackcloth and ashes on. And maybe as they were coming out as a symbol of trying to move towards gladness, they might anoint themselves with oil. But when someone else anointed you with oil, it was to show that you are the guest of honor, that you are a prized relationship. And I want you to try to get your mind, because this is a bit of a confrontational passage, especially if you think that God's just tolerating you, or that God you kind of exhaust him, or one day he'll really be crazy about you, but right now he's just kind of perpetually disappointed. Well, what's happening here is you've showed up, and man, he's run towards you and he's pouring oil to show everybody, enemies and everybody else at the table, that you are his beloved. And then he throws a chalice into your hand, starts to pour into your cup out of his infinite fullness until your cup overflows. This is a beautiful picture of God's love, pursuit, rejoicing, delighting, celebrating gladness in those who are in his flock. And I think it's especially beautifully placed coming right after this idea that you and I are going to endure difficult seasons. You and I are going to have seasons where we feel like God's abandoned us, and we're going to find him in those places as the great comforter with his rod and his staff, being there to guide us and comfort us and protect us. And then that season's going to give way into the season of feasting. And that's not, I don't want you to think, yeah, once I die, once I go to heaven, all of that happens. The reality, because of the righteousness that's been imputed to you, is that's actually happening right now. That God, even in this moment, regardless of the season of life you're in, and I know I've said that 40 times in this study, regardless of where you are, this is true about you right now, that He delights in you and wants to bless you and wants to give and graciously extend out of His richness into your poverty the beauty of what it means to belong to the household of faith. I think the place that we see this most clearly, and I would even argue most beautifully, is in Luke chapter 15. We've already covered John 10:10, where Jesus says, the thief, those other shepherds, they come to kill, to steal, and to destroy. But I have come that you might have life, so you might have this feast. You might have it to the full. But I think where you see it in a parable that Jesus tells is in Luke 15 about the parable of the prodigal son. It's a son that blows all his inheritance, that according to the passage defiles the father's property with prostitution and drunkenness. And the father, scanning the horizon, sees his son, who has not come ultimately to apologize, but has come out of desperation because he's got nowhere else to go. He's come just to go, make me a slave here. Better to be a slave to you than it is to be just on my own out there. And the father's just not having any of this. You see exactly what's going on in this passage in Luke 15 when the father runs out, grabs hold of the son, and embraces a son who had been wallowing around with the pigs. He embraces him. He throws a ring on his finger, the best robe, and then he kills the fatted calf. And later on in Luke 15, the older brother in the field could hear the party in the field. The text literally says, and he heard music and dancing, and asked a servant to come over and ask what was going on up at the house. So that when the prodigal turns home, when the prodigal comes towards Jesus, when we finally surrender to the comfort and the guidance of the Good Shepherd, then there's a kind of celebration that erupts, according to Luke 15, where dancing can be heard out in the fields. And I know it probably makes us Baptists a little bit worried hearing that word in this study, but it's to denote really the celebratory nature of what it means to belong to the household of faith. And so I wonder, are you in a spot where you can really believe that Christ's righteousness imputed to you, that path of righteousness that's been given to you for the name and sake of God, could move God's heart towards you in this way? Is it possible for you? Because I think if you don't get these things, then what happens is you spend all the days of your life trying to earn this kind of love, trying to earn this kind of acceptance. And it'd be a shame if you grew weary trying to earn something that God is freely handing to you simply by being of His flock. I pray rest for your soul after this session. I pray just a peace, a knowledge of God's delight and love and joy and celebratory heart over you as His son and daughter.